The day Mark brought Vanessa through our front door, introducing her as his colleague who needed a place to stay, I smiled warmly and offered her coffee. What they didn't know as they exchanged those secret glances was that the house they were standing in, the beautiful craftsman home we'd spent 8 years turning into our dream space, was solely in my name. The car Mark drove to work every day? In my name. Our vacation cabin at Cedar Lake? My name. The joint accounts we'd shared, for our entire marriage, emptied 3 weeks earlier, with every penny legally transferred to my private accounts. My husband thought he was being clever, moving his mistress into our home while he figured out how to leave me with nothing. But I'd discovered their affair, months ago, and with the help of a brilliant lawyer, I'd already ensured Mark would be the one left empty-handed. The look on his face 2 days later when he finally worked up the courage to ask for a divorce, and Jeffrey Simmons, my attorney, showed him the paperwork. That moment alone was worth every penny I paid in legal fees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I hadn't always been this calculating, this prepared. For most of our 10-year marriage, I was the trusting wife, the supportive partner who believed in Mark's ambitions and our shared future. I grew up in a middle-class family in Oak Ridge, where my parents, David and Susan Mitchell, taught high school and raised my sister Amy and me with strong values but modest means. I worked my way through college, built a promising career at Momentum Marketing, and met Mark Wilson at a charity gala I was coordinating. Mark came from Westlake Heights, the affluent part of Oak Ridge where colonial homes sat on sprawling properties and family names carried weight. His parents, Robert and Helen Wilson, made their disapproval of me clear from the beginning. I wasn't from the right background, didn't have the right connections. But Mark seemed different from his family, more genuine, less concerned with status. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, I believed we would build something real together, something based on love rather than social standing. The first few years of marriage were everything I'd hoped for. We bought our craftsman home in a charming neighborhood, not as prestigious as Westlake Heights, but perfect for us. Mark's career at Summit Financial Group flourished, and I continued, rising through the ranks at Momentum. We traveled, we entertained, we talked about having children when the time was right. I was patient, believing we were building toward the same goals. The subtle shifts were almost imperceptible at first. Mark started working later, checking his phone more frequently, guarding it with a new password. Weekend trips to visit friends I'd never met. His increasing criticisms of my clothes, my cooking, the way I managed our home. Each comment chipped away at my confidence. Each unexplained absence created distance between us. Still, I made excuses for him, blamed his stress at work, tried harder to be the wife he seemed to want. It was Olivia, my best friend since college, who finally forced me to see the truth. We were having lunch at Copper Cup Cafe when she put down her fork and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. "Rachel, I need to tell you something, and you need to promise not to shoot the messenger," she said, her voice low and serious. I nodded, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. I saw Mark yesterday at Harborview Bistro. He was with a woman, and they weren't discussing business unless business meetings now involve kissing and holding hands across the table. My first instinct was denial. Mark wouldn't do that to me. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps Olivia had mistaken someone else for him, but the details she provided were too specific, too precise. The blue tie I'd given him for his birthday, the corner table by the window, the way he leaned forward when he laughed, touching his right temple, a gesture I knew intimately after a decade together. "Did you take photos?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. "I did," Olivia replied, sliding her phone across the table. "I'm so sorry, Rachel." The images were unambiguous. Mark and a beautiful brunette, their hands intertwined, sharing a level of intimacy that only comes with familiarity. In one photo, he was brushing her hair from her face with the same tenderness he'd once shown me. I returned Olivia's phone without comment and excused myself to the restroom, where I stood in front of the mirror, studying my reflection. I expected to see tears, but instead found a strange calm in my eyes. This wasn't a shocking revelation. It was confirmation of something I'd sensed but refused to acknowledge. When I returned to the table, Olivia was watching me with concern. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I answered truthfully. "But I'm not going to confront him. Not until I understand exactly what I'm dealing with." That evening, I behaved exactly as I always did. I prepared dinner, asked about Mark's day, shared stories about a challenging client at work. I performed the role of unsuspecting wife perfectly while my mind cataloged every aspect of our life together. Our finances, properties, shared assets, future plans. For the first time, I looked at my marriage not as a partnership, but as a business arrangement that might need to be dissolved. The next morning, while Mark was in the shower, I did something I'd never considered before. I checked his email. His password was simple: our wedding anniversary followed by his initials. The irony wasn't lost on me. Within minutes, I found what I was looking for: correspondence with a real estate agent about investment properties I knew nothing about, conversations with his brother Eric about restructuring assets before making any moves, and emails to someone named Vanessa Collins that made my heart pound in my chest. "I'm working on the plan we discussed," one email read. "It needs to be handled carefully to protect what's mine. She's always been trusting, which works in our favor, but her name is on too many documents. My brother says timing is everything with these situations." Another. "The Westlake Heights property is almost ready. Once everything is transferred, we can start our real life together. Just a few more months of patience." The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was calculated, strategic. Mark wasn't just having an affair. He was plotting to leave me destitute while he built a new life with Vanessa in a property I knew nothing about. I took screenshots of everything, emailed them to myself, then carefully restored his inbox to appear untouched. That afternoon, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and made 2 appointments. One with Jeffrey Simmons, supposedly the most ruthless divorce attorney in Oak Ridge, and another with Diana Chen, a financial advisor recommended by Olivia. Jeffrey's office was minimalist and imposing, much like the man himself. He listened without interruption as I outlined my situation, showing no reaction to the screenshots or my suspicions. "Mrs. Wilson, what is your ideal outcome here?" he asked when I finished. "I want what's rightfully mine," I replied, "and I want to make sure Mark doesn't leave me with nothing while he runs off with his girlfriend." Jeffrey smiled for the first time, a small, sharp expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Fortunately for you, you've discovered this before he could implement whatever exit strategy he's planning. That gives us options." Those options, as Jeffrey explained, would require me to be patient, observant, and strategic, qualities I wasn't sure I possessed in the face of such betrayal. But as he outlined what Mark might be planning and how we could counteract it, I felt something unexpected, a sense of empowerment replacing the initial shock and hurt. "Can you continue to act normally at home? Give no indication that you're aware of the affair or his plans?" Jeffrey asked. I thought about the dinner I'd prepared just hours after seeing those photos, the conversation I'd maintained while my world was collapsing around me. "Yes, I can do that." "Good, because we need time to protect your interests, and the element of surprise is our greatest advantage." The next week was the strangest of my life. By day, I met with financial experts, documented our assets, and began the careful process of securing what was legally mine. By night, I returned to our home, cooked dinner, and slept beside a man who was actively planning to destroy my future. Diana Chen, the financial advisor, was ruthlessly efficient. After reviewing our finances, she highlighted vulnerabilities I hadn't considered. "Your husband works in finance, which means he knows exactly how to hide assets," she warned. "The good news is that most of your major purchases, the house, the lake cabin, were made with funds from your joint accounts, and both your names are on the deeds. What concerns me is this pattern of withdrawals from your joint savings over the past 6 months. She showed me a series of transactions I'd never noticed. 10,000 here, 15,000 there, always just below the threshold that would trigger a notification to my phone. "Where is this money going?" I asked, though I already suspected. The answer: based on these records, into an account at First Capital Trust, an account in his name only. The sum total was staggering. Nearly $200,000 of our joint savings, gradually siphoned away while I trusted him to manage our finances. "Can I get it back?" Diana's expression was grim. "That's a question for your attorney." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But moving forward, we need to protect what remains. Over the next month, with Jeffrey and Diana's guidance, I executed a careful plan. I documented everything in our home: furniture, artwork, electronics, with photos and approximate values. I collected copies of all financial records, property deeds, insurance policies, and tax returns. I opened new accounts at a different bank under my name only. And most importantly, I began the process of legally transferring assets based on a provision in our prenuptial agreement that Mark had insisted upon but clearly forgotten. The irony of that prenup still makes me smile. Mark's parents had pressured him into it, concerned that I, a woman from a modest background, might someday try to claim their family's wealth. The document was primarily designed to protect assets Mark brought into the marriage or inherited from his family. But buried in the legal language was a clause addressing infidelity. If either party engaged in extramarital affairs, the other would be entitled to a larger portion of jointly acquired assets. Mark had been so focused on protecting his family money that he hadn't considered how this clause might someday work against him. And now, with documented evidence of his affair, Jeffrey was able to use this provision to begin legally restructuring our assets. "Everything needs to happen in the correct order," Jeffrey advised. "We don't want to trigger his suspicion before we've secured the major assets." We started with the lake cabin, which was the simplest transfer since we rarely visited during winter months. Then came the investment accounts, which Jeffrey restructured under the guise of tax planning, documents Mark signed without careful reading, trusting my explanation that our accountant had recommended these changes. Finally, and most delicately, came the house. This required the most creativity and the most risk. Mark needed to voluntarily sign documents transferring the property solely to me, which seemed impossible without raising alarms. But Jeffrey found an elegant solution involving a manufactured liability concern related to Mark's position at Summit Financial. It's common for financial advisors to protect their primary residences from potential lawsuits, Jeffrey explained. "We'll present this as asset protection, not divorce planning." I arranged a meeting with our estate attorney, a different one than Jeffrey, to avoid suspicion. And Mark readily agreed to the proposed changes. He even looked relieved, believing he was protecting our home from potential professional liabilities, while still maintaining access to it through our marriage. The day Mark signed those papers, transferring our craftsman home solely into my name, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. The man sitting across from me, confidently scrawling, his signature was both familiar and a complete stranger. How had we reached this point? When had he decided I was disposable, an obstacle to overcome on his way to a different life? But I couldn't dwell on these questions, not when there was still work to be done. The final step in our plan was the most drastic: emptying our joint accounts. This would immediately alert Mark, which meant timing was crucial. Jeffrey advised waiting for a clear sign that Mark was preparing to make his move. That sign came sooner than expected. 3 months. Into my secret preparations, I overheard a phone conversation between Mark and his brother Eric as I returned home early from work. "She's completely clueless," Mark was saying, his voice carrying from his home office. "Vanessa's getting impatient, but everything's almost in place. Another 2 weeks, and the Westlake Heights house will be ready. I've moved most of the important assets already." Eric's response was audible through the speakerphone. "What's your exit strategy with Rachel? You know she's going to fight this." Mark's laugh chilled me. Fight with what? By the time she figures out what's happening, there won't be much left to fight over. I've documented her emotional instability for months now. Outbursts, irrational behavior, all in emails to my therapist. It's amazing what judges consider during asset division when mental health issues are involved. I stood frozen in the hallway, a new level of betrayal washing over me. Mark wasn't just planning to leave me, he was creating a false narrative about my mental health to strengthen his position. The calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I sent a one-word text to Jeffrey. "Now." The next morning, I visited 3 banks before Mark's first client. Meeting would end. I transferred every penny from our joint accounts into my new private accounts, submitted the paperwork Jeffrey had prepared to freeze the investment accounts pending review, and delivered documents to Summit Financial's HR department regarding potential ethics violations in Mark's handling of our joint finances. By noon, it was done. Our joint accounts were empty, our investments frozen, our properties legally mine. I returned home and waited, a strange calm settling over me as I prepared for the storm. Mark's call came at 2:17 p.m., his voice tight with controlled fury. "Rachel, there's some kind of mistake with our accounts. Everything's showing 0 balances. I'm trying to sort it out with the bank." "Is there a problem?" I asked innocently. "I can check my app." "Don't worry about it," he said quickly. "I'll handle it. Just a system error, probably." "If you're sure," I replied. "By the way, do you think you'll be home for dinner? I was thinking of making that pasta you like." The momentary silence told me he was recalibrating, unsure how to proceed when I wasn't behaving according to his expectations. "Actually, I might be late. Don't wait up." That evening, Mark didn't come home at all. He wasn't answering my texts asking where he was or when he'd return. Exactly the paper trail of concerned wife messages Jeffrey had advised me to create. The next day brought a flurry of frantic calls from various banks and investment firms, all asking for Mark Wilson. I politely explained he wasn't available and took detailed messages. By evening, his absence had stretched to 36 hours with no communication, another point in my favor, according to Jeffrey, who was documenting the timeline of abandonment. On day 3, Mark finally returned home, looking disheveled and accompanied by a woman I recognized immediately from Olivia's photos, Vanessa Collins. She was even more beautiful in person, tall, elegant, with the kind of confidence that comes from always being the most attractive woman in any room. "Rachel," Mark said with forced casualness, "this is Vanessa, my colleague from Summit. Her apartment had a major water leak, and she needs a place to stay for a few days. I volunteered our guest room." I smiled warmly, extending my hand to the woman who had been sleeping with my husband. "Of course, any colleague of Mark's is welcome here. The guest room is already made up. I change the sheets every week." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. They had clearly expected resistance, anger, questioning, not this pleasant acquiescence. Their planned narrative of my emotional instability was crumbling before they could even deploy it. "That's very kind of you," Vanessa said hesitantly, shaking my hand. Her eyes darted to Mark, seeking guidance. "I'll show Vanessa to the guest room. Mark said quickly. And then maybe we could talk? Of course, I agreed. I'll make some coffee. As they disappeared upstairs with Vanessa's suitcase, I texted, Olivia. She's here, in our house, it's happening. Olivia's response was immediate. Holy shit. Are you okay? Need me to come over? No, I replied. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. When Mark came downstairs alone, his expression had shifted from confusion to determination. This was it. The moment he'd been preparing for, though certainly not under the circumstances he'd imagined. Rachel, we need to talk about our marriage, he began, accepting the coffee I offered. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time. I nodded, my expression sympathetic. I'm listening. He seemed thrown by my calmness, but continued with his practiced speech. I think we should consider separating, taking some time apart to reevaluate what we want. Is this because of Vanessa? I asked mildly. He stiffened. Vanessa is a colleague and a friend. This isn't about her. This is about us, about fundamental incompatibilities that I think we've both been ignoring. I see, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. And what would this separation look like exactly, practically speaking? This was clearly the opening he'd been waiting for. Mark shifted into the confident financial advisor persona he wore so well. I've given it some thought. I think it makes sense for me to keep the house since I cover most of the mortgage. You could find an apartment. I'd provide support during the transition, of course. The lake cabin could be sold, and we'd split those proceeds. As for the rest of our assets, I let him continue, outlining his generous vision of our separation, one where he retained virtually everything of value while portraying himself as reasonable and supportive. When he finally finished, I smiled. That's an interesting proposal, I said. I have a counteroffer. Mark's eyebrows rose. A counteroffer? Yes. Since the house is in my name only, as is the lake cabin, I'll be keeping both properties. The joint accounts you've been systematically emptying over the past 6 months have been replenished from your personal account at First Capital Trust, as ordered by the court yesterday in response to my attorney's emergency petition. Oh, and Summit Financial's Ethics Committee would like to meet with you tomorrow regarding some irregularities in client fund management that came to light during their review. The color drained from Mark's face. What are you talking about? The house isn't in your name. The cabin isn't. Check the property records, I suggested. They're public, after all. As for the accounts, I believe your bank has been trying to reach you. Something about unusual activity and possible fraud. Alerts. Mark's hands began to shake. This is insane. You can't just... Actually, I can, and I did. Everything was done legally, with proper documentation and witnesses, some of it with your own signature. I reached into a drawer and removed a business card, sliding it across the table. This is Jeffrey Simmons, my attorney. He's expecting your call, or rather, your attorney's call. I'd suggest finding one quickly. Mark stared at the card, then at me, shock giving way to fury. You planned this, all of it, for how long? Not as long as you've been planning to leave me destitute while you start a new life with Vanessa in Westlake Heights, I replied calmly. By the way, that property isn't in your name anymore either. The purchase was made with funds from our joint investments, which makes it marital property subject to the infidelity clause in our prenup. A noise from the doorway drew our attention. Vanessa stood there, her perfect composure cracking. What's happening, Mark? What is she talking about? Mark ignored her, his focus entirely on me. You won't get away with this. No judge will. Every judge will, I interrupted. Because everything is documented. Your affair, your financial maneuvers, your attempt to manufacture concerns about my mental health to strengthen your position. It's all admissible and damning. Vanessa stepped further into the kitchen. Mark, you said this would be simple, that she'd fall apart, and we'd... Be quiet, Vanessa, Mark snapped. This isn't helping. I stood, gathering my purse and car keys. I'll leave you two to discuss your next steps. I'm staying at Olivia's tonight to give you space to process. I expect you both to be gone by tomorrow evening. As I reached the B door, I turned back. Mark was slumped at the table, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Vanessa hovered uncertainly, the dynamic between them already shifting in the face of this unexpected crisis. One more thing, I added. The security cameras I had installed last month have captured some interesting conversations between you. 2 in this house while I was at work. Nothing too explicit. I'm not interested in that kind of leverage. But plenty of discussions about your plans for me once I was out of the picture. Jeffrey has those recordings as well. With that, I walked out the door, leaving them in what was now legally my house, surrounded by my possessions, facing a future neither of them had anticipated. In my car, the composure I'd maintained finally cracked. Tears came, not for the marriage I'd lost, but for the years I'd invested in someone who had been planning my downfall while sleeping beside me. I cried for the future I'd imagined, for the children we'd never have, for the trust I'd given so freely that had been so thoroughly betrayed. But beneath the grief was something unexpected. Pride. Pride in my resilience, in my capacity for strategic thinking, in my refusal to be victimized. I had transformed from the trusting, supportive wife into someone capable of protecting herself when no one else would. As I drove toward Olivia's house, I realized that while Mark had been planning to discard me, he had inadvertently set me free. Free from a marriage built on lies. Free from a future with someone who saw me as disposable. Free to discover who Rachel Wilson could be beyond the constraints of a relationship that had slowly been suffocating me. The road ahead would be challenging. Divorce proceedings, asset negotiations, rebuilding my life on new terms. But for the first time in months, I was driving toward something rather than running from something. And that made all the difference. The following weeks were a blur of legal maneuvering and emotional aftershocks. Mark, as Jeffrey had predicted, hired Graham Fletcher, the most expensive divorce attorney in Oak Ridge, known for representing the city's elite in contentious splits. But expensive representation couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence we'd accumulated or the legally binding documents Mark had willingly signed. Our first mediation session was surreal. I sat across from the man I'd slept beside for a decade, now flanked by attorneys and financial advisors, discussing the dissolution of our shared life in clinical terms. Mark looked smaller somehow, his usual confidence replaced by a tightly controlled anger that occasionally slipped through the professional veneer. My client believes Mrs. Wilson has engaged in deliberate deception and manipulation, Graham Fletcher stated, his polished tone doing little to disguise the accusation. She took advantage of Mr. Wilson's trust to orchestrate what amounts to financial ambush. Jeffrey remained unruffled. That's an interesting perspective, considering the documented evidence of Mr. Wilson's systematic diversion of marital funds, his extensive affair with Ms. Collins, and his explicitly stated plans to leave Mrs. Wilson financially compromised. Perhaps Mr. Wilson would care to explain the emails discussing his strategy to, and I quote, leave her with nothing worth fighting for. Mark's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Jeffrey methodically outlined the timeline of Mark's deception, alongside my countering legal moves. Everything I'd done had been reactive, defensive, and, most importantly, legal. Mrs. Wilson simply protected what was rightfully hers, Jeffrey concluded. Had Mr. Wilson not been planning to leave his wife destitute while establishing a new household with his mistress, none of these protective measures would have been necessary. The mediator, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years of family law experience, reviewed the documentation silently before addressing us. Mr. Wilson, given the evidence presented, particularly the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause, which you willingly signed, I don't believe continued mediation will be productive for your position. I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach. It was a polite way of saying Mark had no case, and everyone in the room knew it. Outside the mediation room, Mark caught my arm as I was leaving, his fingers digging in with more force than necessary. "You've ruined everything," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've done." I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. I protected myself from someone who saw me as disposable. That's not winning, Mark. That's surviving. As I walked away, I felt his eyes burning into my back, but the fear his anger might have once provoked was gone. I had faced his betrayal and emerged stronger. What power could his resentment hold over me now? Olivia's guest room became my sanctuary for the next few weeks. Every morning I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of her ridiculous rooster-shaped timer going off in the kitchen. Every evening we'd share a bottle of wine and talk through the day's developments. Her unwavering support was a lifeline when everything else felt unmoored. "Have you considered what you're going to do with the house?" she asked one evening as we sat on her back porch, watching lightning bugs rise from the grass. "Will you stay there?" I hadn't made a decision yet. The craftsman home held 10 years of memories, some beautiful, some now tainted by the knowledge of Mark's duplicity. I'd loved that house, had poured my heart into making it a home, but the thought of continuing to live there alone felt strange. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It's too big for just me, but it feels like giving up something else if I sell it." Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you need a clean break, a fresh start." "Maybe," I agreed, though the thought of more change when everything else in my life was in flux made my stomach tighten. I just need to get through the divorce first. But the divorce proceedings weren't going as smoothly as the mediation had suggested they might. Mark, unable to accept the collapse of his carefully constructed exit plan, seemed determined to drag the process out as long as possible. He contested everything, demanded forensic accounting of all financial transfers, and even attempted to claim that I had coerced him into signing the property transfers. Jeffrey remained unworried. "This is just spite and delay tactics," he assured me. "The legal facts haven't changed. He's just running up his own legal bills at this point." What I didn't anticipate was how Mark would retaliate outside the courtroom. The first sign came when my boss at Momentum called me into his office, his expression grave. "Rachel, we've received some concerning information about you," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "Allegations of unethical conduct with client accounts." My shock must have been evident because he quickly clarified, "I don't believe them. To be clear, your work has always been impeccable, but Mark has sent formal complaints to our board of directors, and we're required to investigate." The evidence Mark had provided was flimsy at best. Doctored emails, out-of-context conversations, financial discrepancies that were easily explained. But the investigation itself was humiliating, forcing me to defend my professional reputation against baseless accusations. Then came the social fallout. Invitations to events dried up. Friends we'd shared for years suddenly became busy when I suggested getting together. At a charity auction I'd helped organize, I overheard whispered comments about my vindictive behavior, my calculated targeting of Mark's career. "He's spinning a narrative," Olivia fumed when I told her about the charity auction, making himself the victim. "It's working," I said quietly. "People are believing him." Olivia squeezed my hand. "People who matter won't, and the rest can go to hell." But it wasn't just social circles where Mark's damage control was having an effect. Somehow he'd managed to get Vanessa her own apartment in Westlake Heights, the property that should have been contested as a marital asset. When I asked Jeffrey how this was possible, his explanation was concerning. "It appears Mr. Wilson has found other resources, funds we weren't aware of." He frowned at the financial report in front of him. "We need to dig deeper into his family's involvement." The Wilsons I'd almost forgotten about Mark's parents in the chaos of the past months. Robert and Helen had never approved of me, had always regarded our marriage as a regrettable phase their son would eventually outgrow. If they were financially supporting Mark now, providing him with resources beyond those we'd identified and secured, the battle could get much more complicated. How much influence could they have? I asked. Jeffrey's expression was grim. Robert. Wilson sits on the board of First Capital Trust. He's golfing buddies with Judge Harmon, who could potentially be assigned to your case. And Helen chairs 3 charitable foundations whose donors include half the influential families in Oak Ridge. The implications were clear. While the legal facts remained on my side, the Wilsons had social and financial capital that could make my life very difficult during and after the divorce. So what do? We adjust our strategy. If they want to fight dirty, we need to be prepared. That night, unable to sleep in Olivia's guest room, I found myself staring at the ceiling, contemplating the escalating war with Mark and his family. This wasn't what I'd wanted. I'd only aimed to protect myself, to ensure I wasn't left with nothing after a decade of partnership. Now I was embroiled in a vindictive battle that was contaminating every aspect of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my breath caught. You think you're clever, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. The Wilsons protect their own. You'll regret the day you decided to fight us. I showed the message to Jeffrey the next morning. His response was immediate. File a police report for harassment. Change my phone number. Document everything. But the damage was done. The threat, however vague, had accomplished its purpose. I felt unsafe, watched, vulnerable in a way I hadn't since discovering Mark's betrayal. This is psychological warfare, Diana Chen said when I met with her to review the latest financial developments. They're trying to wear you down, make you grateful for any settlement just to end the conflict. She was right, and knowing their tactics didn't make them any less effective. The constant stress was taking a physical toll. Sleepless nights, loss of appetite, a perpetual tension headache that no amount of painkillers seemed to touch. I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking over my shoulder when walking to my car, scanning restaurant interiors before being seated. You can't continue like this, Olivia insisted after finding me awake at 3 a.m, scrolling through legal documents on my laptop. They're winning if they break down your health. The realization hit me with unexpected clarity. I was fighting on their terms, allowing them to dictate the battlefield. If I continued this way, even a legal victory would feel like a defeat, given the cost to my well-being. That morning, I called Jeffrey with a new proposal. I want to offer a settlement, I said without preamble. Rachel, we have the stronger position. There's no need to... It's not about need. It's about ending this phase of my life and starting the next. I'm willing to compromise on certain assets if it means bringing this to a swift conclusion. Jeffrey was silent for a moment. What kind of compromise did you have in mind? My offer was straightforward. I would keep the house and cabin, both already legally in my name. I would retain the investment accounts we'd secured, but I would drop my claim to the Westlake Heights property and agree to a non-disclosure agreement about the details of our separation, giving Mark the public narrative he seemed to crave. You're giving up significant financial leverage, Jeffrey warned. I'm buying my freedom, I corrected, and my peace of mind. To my surprise, Mark accepted the offer almost immediately. Perhaps he too was tired of the conflict, or perhaps he recognized that dragging out the proceedings would only deplete the resources his parents were providing. Whatever his motivation, 2 weeks later, we sat in a conference room signing the final divorce agreement, officially ending our 10-year marriage with signatures on legal documents. Mark didn't look at me throughout the process, his pen moving mechanically across the pages as our attorneys directed. When the last document was signed, he stood abruptly. Congratulations, he said. his voice flat. You got what you wanted. I met his gaze steadily. No, Mark. I got what I needed. There's a difference. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. I remained seated, a strange emptiness replacing the tension that had driven me for months. It was over. The battle, the marriage, the chapter of my life defined by being Mrs. Mark Wilson. What now? Jeffrey asked as he gathered the documents. Now, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I figure out who Rachel is when she's standing on her own. That evening, I stood in the craftsman house, my house, for the first time since the day I'd walked out leaving Mark and Vanessa in the kitchen. Olivia had offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do alone. The space felt different, as if the walls themselves held memories of the betrayal and confrontation that had unfolded here. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar objects, opening windows to let fresh air replace the stillness. In my bedroom, Mark's closet stood empty, the hangers a silent testament to his absence. I hadn't decided yet whether to stay or sell, but being there helped clarify my thinking. This house, beautiful as it was, represented a life built on false premises. Every room held traces of plans made with someone who had been plotting my disposal. I didn't want to build my new life on that foundation. As I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, my phone rang. It was Diana Chen. I'm calling with good news, she said without preamble. The investment accounts have fully transferred, and the values have actually increased since freezing. You're in an excellent financial position moving forward. Financial security had been my primary goal when I first discovered Mark's betrayal, but now it felt like just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Yes, I had protected myself materially, but the real victory was internal, the discovery of my own resilience, my capacity for strategic action, my refusal to be victimized. Thank you, Diana, for everything. What will you do next? She asked. I looked out at the garden Mark and I had planted together, the roses just beginning to bloom despite months of neglect. I'm going to sell this house, start fresh somewhere new. Sounds like a wise decision, Diana said. New beginnings deserve new spaces. After we hung up, I remained on the porch until darkness fell completely, the first stars appearing in the velvet sky. Tomorrow would bring logistics, realtors to contact, decisions about what to keep and what to discard, practical considerations about where to live next. But tonight was for acknowledging the ending and honoring the strength it had taken to reach this point. Mark had intended to discard me, to leave me emotionally and financially devastated while he built a new life with Vanessa. Instead, he had inadvertently forced me to discover resources within myself I might never have recognized otherwise. In trying to render me powerless, he had actually catalyzed my empowerment. As I locked the door behind me, leaving the empty house to its memories, I felt the weight of the past months beginning to lift. The divorce was finalized. The house would soon belong to someone else. The painful chapter was closing. What remained was the woman who had emerged from the crucible, stronger, wiser, and ready to write the next chapter entirely on her own terms. Selling the craftsman house proved easier than expected. The real estate market in Oak Ridge was hot, and the property's charm, combined with its prime location, attracted multiple offers within days of listing. I accepted one significantly above asking price, with the condition that closing would happen quickly. Jeffrey advised setting up a trust for the proceeds, a protective measure in case Mark or his family attempted any further financial maneuvers. Just because the divorce is final doesn't mean they've accepted defeat, he cautioned. Old money families like the Wilsons tend to nurse grudges. Diana helped me invest a portion of the funds, creating a diverse portfolio that would provide both growth and security. The remainder I kept liquid, uncertain of my next steps, but determined to have resources available when direction became clear. The lake cabin presented a different challenge. Unlike the house, which held painful memories of betrayal, the cabin remained untainted, a sanctuary where Mark and I had spent little time together, where I'd often retreated alone to write or read or simply exist in peaceful solitude. "I'm keeping it," I told Olivia one afternoon as we packed boxes in the craftsman home. "At least for now. It feels like the one piece of my married life that was truly mine." Olivia nodded, understanding without requiring explanation. She'd been my rock throughout the ordeal, offering practical help and emotional support without judgment. Now, as I sorted through the physical remnants of my marriage, deciding what to keep and what to discard, her presence made the process less overwhelming. "What about this?" she asked, holding up a framed photograph of Mark and me on our honeymoon, smiling on a beach in Bali, the sunset casting a golden glow over our faces. I studied it for a moment, searching for the expected pain. Instead, I felt a curious detachment, as if looking at strangers who happened to resemble us. "Donation pile," I decided. I don't need physical reminders of a relationship that existed mostly in my imagination. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "In your imagination?" "The marriage I thought I had, equal, honest, built on mutual respect. That wasn't real." I sealed another box with packing tape, the sound sharp in the half-empty room. The real marriage was something else entirely, a temporary arrangement until Mark found someone he deemed more suitable. "That's a harsh assessment," I shrugged. "Maybe, but it's freeing to see things clearly." The clarity extended beyond my marriage. As I dismantled the life I'd built with Mark, I found myself reevaluating other relationships, other choices that had led me to this point. Friends who had sided with Mark without hearing my perspective were easy to release. Professional connections that had proven superficial when tested fell away without regret. What surprised me was the emergence of unexpected support. Amy, my sister, flew in from Seattle to help with the final move, bringing not just practical assistance, but a fierce protectiveness I hadn't experienced since childhood. Melissa, a colleague from Momentum who had defended me during the ethics investigation, became a trusted confidant. Even my parents, who had always been reserved in their opinions about Mark, revealed they had harbored concerns about his character for years. "He reminded me too much of my brother Richard," my father admitted during a long phone call. "All charm on the surface, but cold underneath. I should have said something." "It wouldn't have mattered," I assured him. "I needed to see it for myself." And I had seen it, not just Mark's capacity for deception, but the broader pattern of my own life. I had been so focused on proving my worth, on earning acceptance from Mark and his family, that I'd compromised parts of myself along the way. Small compromises at first. Preferences set aside, opinions softened, ambitions recalibrated to accommodate his priorities. Eventually, those small sacrifices had accumulated into a version of Rachel that existed primarily to complement Mark's life rather than to live her own. Never again. That was the promise I made to myself as I handed over the YI's keys to the craftsman house and drove away for the last time. Never again would I diminish myself to accommodate someone else's narrative. Never again would I mistake control for protection or confuse sacrifice with love. With the house sold and most of my possessions either donated or placed in storage, I found myself temporarily homeless, but extraordinarily free. I stayed with Olivia for a few weeks, then spent a month at the lake cabin, its rustic simplicity providing a perfect environment for reflection. Seated on the dock one evening, watching the sunset ripple across the water, I made a list of what I wanted in this next phase of life. Not a bucket list of achievements or acquisitions, but a framework for living intentionally. Work that engages my creativity and intelligence without consuming my identity. Relationships based on genuine connection rather than social advantage. A home that reflects my personal aesthetic, not a showcase for others. Financial independence maintained through vigilant stewardship. The courage to trust again without surrendering discernment. It wasn't a rejection of partnership or a retreat into isolation. Rather, it was a commitment to approaching future relationships, romantic and otherwise, from a position of wholeness rather than need. I would bring my complete self to the table, not an edited version designed to please or accommodate. When I returned to Oak Ridge, I rented a small apartment downtown. Its modern minimalism a deliberate contrast to the traditional craftsman aesthetic Mark had preferred. The space was temporary, a transitional home while I determined my longer-term path, but I took pleasure in furnishing it exactly as I pleased. Vibrant colors, contemporary art, furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. My professional life required similar reinvention. Though the ethics investigation had cleared me completely, the experience had soured my relationship with Momentum. The agency's leadership had stood by me officially, but their initial willingness to entertain Mark's accusations had revealed an underlying lack of trust that couldn't be rebuilt. I need a change, I told my boss during my resignation meeting. A fresh start professionally as well as personally. He nodded, unsurprised. I expected this. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about how things unfolded. Mark was persuasive. He always is, I agreed. That's what makes him dangerous. Rather than immediately seeking another position, I decided to explore independent consulting. My expertise in marketing strategy was valuable, and several former clients had already reached out, preferring to work with me directly rather than through an agency. The flexible schedule would allow time for personal recovery while maintaining financial stability. I was designing a website for my new consulting business when Diana Chen called with unexpected news. "You're not going to believe this," she said, an unusual edge of excitement in her normally composed voice. "Summit Financial is under investigation for ethical violations and potential fraud. The SEC is involved." "Summit, Mark's firm. What kind of violations?" "The details aren't public yet, but my sources say it involves improper handling of client funds, misleading investment advice, and failure to disclose conflicts of interest." Diana paused. "Apparently, it centers on practices within the high net worth." "Client division." "Mark's division." I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. "When did this start?" "The investigation has been ongoing for months, but they just executed search warrants at the Summit offices yesterday. It's about to become very public." The timing explained so much. Mark's accelerated timeline for leaving me, his desperate attempts to secure assets before everything collapsed, his willingness to accept my settlement offer despite his initial rage. He hadn't been planning just a new life with Vanessa. He'd been preparing for potential legal and financial catastrophe. "Is Mark specifically named in the investigation?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to call Jeffrey. "Not in what I've heard, but given his position, it seems inevitable. He'll be implicated." I thanked Diana for the information, then immediately contacted Jeffrey, who promised to look into potential implications for me as Mark's former spouse. "If he was engaged in fraudulent activities during your marriage, there could be exposure risks," he warned. "But the fact that you've already divorced and divided assets likely provides some protection." The news about Summit broke publicly. The following day, dominating local business coverage and sending ripples through Oak Ridge's tight-knit financial community. Mark's name wasn't mentioned in the initial reports, but industry insiders would recognize his connection to the implicated division. I braced for fallout, concerned clients calling, mutual acquaintances seeking gossip, perhaps even reporters, looking for the ex-wife's perspective. Instead, a strange silence followed. My phone remained quiet except for normal business communications. Even Olivia, usually my primary source for community rumors, had nothing to report. "It's weird," she said when we met for coffee at Copper Cup. "Nobody's talking about Mark specifically, just Summit in general. It's like his name has been scrubbed from the narrative. The Wilson family influence at work, I suspected. Robert's connections would be mobilized to protect Mark, to distance him from the growing scandal. Whether those efforts would ultimately succeed remained to be seen. The answer came 3 weeks later, when Jeffrey called with news from his SEC contacts. Mark isn't being charged, he said without preamble. He's cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity. Cooperating how? I asked, surprised. By the surge of anger I felt at the thought of Mark escaping consequences yet again. Providing evidence against his superiors, apparently. According to my source, he approached the SEC voluntarily months ago with documentation of questionable practices. He's positioned himself as a whistleblower rather than a participant. The calculation was so perfectly Mark, identifying the losing position early and switching sides to ensure personal advantage. I wondered if his parents had orchestrated this strategy or if Mark had developed it independently, an evolution of the self-preservation instincts the Wilsons had cultivated in their son. Does this affect me at all? I asked, focusing on the practical rather than the emotional. It shouldn't. Your divorce was finalized before any of this became public, and the assets you retained weren't directly connected to Summit. But I'd suggest staying completely clear of any involvement or commentary. The less association you have with this situation, the better. I had no intention of inserting myself into Mark's latest crisis. My life was finally developing momentum in a new direction, and I had no desire to redirect that energy toward old wounds. Let Mark navigate the consequences of his choices without me as an audience or participant. But separation wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. Though I had no contact with Mark himself, the Summit scandal created ripples that reached me indirectly. Potential clients for my consulting business asked cautious questions about my ex-husband's situation. Former colleagues from Momentum sent concerned texts checking if I was handling things okay. Even my landlord made an awkward reference to all that trouble at Summit when I dropped off my rent check. The assumptions behind these interactions were clear. As Mark's ex-wife, I must be either devastated by his troubles or gleefully celebrating his downfall. No one seemed to consider a third possibility, that I had moved beyond defining myself in relation to Mark Wilson entirely. People love a simple narrative, my sister Amy observed during one of our weekly calls. Wronged wife gets revenge, or loyal wife stands by fallen husband. Woman builds completely independent life and is genuinely indifferent to ex's problems doesn't fit neatly into their expectations. Their expectations aren't my responsibility, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I'm not performing a role in someone else's story anymore. That clarity guided my response to the most unexpected development in the Summit scandal, a voice message from Vanessa Collins that appeared on my phone 6 weeks after the investigation became public. Rachel, it's Vanessa. Her voice sounded strained, lacking the cool confidence I remembered from our brief interaction in my kitchen. I know you have no reason to speak with me, but I think we should talk. About Mark. About what's really happening at Summit. Please call me back. I played the message twice, weighing my options. The rational response would be to delete it immediately, to maintain the clean break I'd worked so hard to establish. Jeffrey would certainly advise against any contact with someone so closely connected to both Mark and the Summit situation. Yet curiosity nagged at me. What could Vanessa possibly want to discuss? What did she mean by what's really happening? And why approach me of all people? After careful consideration, I forwarded the message to Jeffrey with a brief note. Received this from Vanessa Collins. Inclined to ignore, but wanted your perspective on potential motives. His response came, quickly, absolutely do not engage. This has all the hallmarks of a setup. Either she's recording conversations at Mark's behest to use against you somehow, or she's genuinely desperate and looking to drag you into whatever mess they're dealing with. Neither scenario benefits you. His assessment aligned with my instincts. I blocked Vanessa's number without returning her call, then did the same for every Summit-associated phone number I could identify. Whatever drama was unfolding in Mark's professional life, I was determined to remain outside its orbit. That determination was tested again 2 days later, when Helen Wilson appeared at my downtown apartment, immaculately dressed as always, her expression a careful neutral that betrayed nothing. "Mrs. Wilson," I said, not bothering to hide my surprise at finding my former mother-in-law standing in my hallway. "This is unexpected." "May I come in?" she asked, her voice carrying that distinctive blend of politeness and command that had always made requests sound like directives. "I don't think that would be appropriate," I replied, remaining in the doorway. "Mark and I are divorced. There's nothing left to discuss." Helen's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly, revealing a flash of the desperation that must have driven her to my door. "This isn't about the divorce. It's about protecting our family name. Surely you can understand that concern, having once been a Wilson yourself." "I understand it was a temporary status," I said evenly. "One your family never fully extended to me?" She had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "Perhaps we were, reserved in our acceptance. But that's water under the bridge now. My concern is the present situation. Summit's legal troubles have nothing to do with me. They will if certain information becomes public," Helen said, her voice dropping. "Information Mark shared with you during your marriage." I studied her face, noting the fine tension lines around her mouth, the slight strain in her usually perfect posture. She was afraid, genuinely afraid in a way I'd never witnessed from the formidable Helen Wilson. "I have no idea what you're referring to," I said truthfully. "And even if I did, I've been advised by counsel to avoid any involvement in Summit's situation." "I'm not asking for involvement," she said quickly. "Quite the opposite. I'm asking for your continued discretion regarding certain family financial arrangements Mark may have discussed with you. Arrangements that could be misinterpreted if mentioned to the wrong people." The implication was clear. The Wilsons had secrets beyond whatever was happening at Summit, secrets they feared I might expose out of spite or revenge. "Mrs. Wilson, I signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of my divorce settlement. I have no intention of discussing anything about Mark or your family with anyone." I kept my tone neutral, neither confirming nor denying knowledge of whatever arrangements had her so concerned. The relief that flickered across her face confirmed my suspicion. This visit wasn't about what I knew, but about ensuring my silence. Whatever Mark had done, whatever the Wilsons were hiding, they considered me a potential threat to their carefully constructed narrative. "I appreciate your understanding," Helen said, regaining her composure. "For what it's worth, I always respected your intelligence and discretion, even if we had our differences." The belated compliment, clearly designed to create goodwill, struck me as darkly humorous given the context of our entire relationship. "Is there anything else, Mrs. Wilson? I have a client meeting to prepare for." She reached into her handbag and produced a business envelope. "Just this, a token of our appreciation for your continued discretion." I didn't take the envelope. "I don't want your money, Mrs. Wilson. I don't want anything from your family except distance." "It's not," she began, then stopped, apparently reconsidering her approach. "Very well, but should you ever find yourself in need of assistance, the offer remains open. The Wilsons do take care of those who respect family interests." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, already closing the door. "Goodbye, Mrs. Wilson." As I turned back to my apartment, a strange lightness filled me. Not just relief at having avoided whatever manipulation Helen had attempted, but genuine freedom from the influence the Wilson family had once held over me. Their approval no longer mattered, their resources no longer tempted, their threats no longer intimidated. I was Rachel Mitchell again, not Rachel Wilson, not Mark's wife. not the outsider trying to earn acceptance from a family that would never truly grant it. Just Rachel, standing firmly on ground of my own creation, navigating forward by my own compass rather than someone else's map. The liberation in that realization was worth more than anything Helen's envelope might have contained. 6 months after finalizing my divorce from Mark, I found myself in an unexpected position of strength. My consulting business had flourished beyond my initial projections, attracting clients who valued strategic thinking and direct communication. The flexible schedule allowed me to spend extended weekends at the lake cabin, where I gradually transformed the space from a vacation property into a true second home. I'd even started dating again. Nothing serious, just occasional dinners with interesting people who had no connection to my previous life in Oak Ridge society. The Summit financial scandal had faded from local headlines, though industry publications still referenced it occasionally when discussing regulatory enforcement. Mark's name rarely appeared in these articles, the result, I suspected, of both his immunity deal and his family's influence over local media. According to Olivia, who remained my primary source for community gossip despite my growing disinterest, Mark and Vanessa had relocated to Boston, where he'd accepted a position with a smaller financial firm owned by a college friend of his father's. "Apparently they're engaged," Olivia mentioned during our weekly coffee meetup at Copper Cup. Heather Brooks told me Vanessa was flashing a ridiculous diamond at her cousin's wedding last month. I stirred my latte, searching for any emotional response to this information. Finding none, I smiled. Good for them. I hope they're very happy together. Olivia studied my face skeptically. "You're seriously not bothered? Not even a little?" "Why would I be?" I asked genuinely. "Mark and I are divorced. He's free to marry whoever he wants. But after everything he did?" "That's exactly why I'm not bothered," I interrupted gently. "I've seen who Mark really is. Vanessa is welcome to him." The truth was more complex than I could easily explain, even to Olivia. My indifference to Mark's engagement wasn't about taking the high road or pretending to be above it all. It was the natural result of genuine emotional detachment, a complete severing of the psychological ties that had once bound me to him. The man who had betrayed me, who had planned to discard me while moving his mistress into our home, now felt like a character from someone else's story, rather than a central figure in my own. That emotional freedom was worth more than any financial settlement, any property division, any social advantage I might have gained or lost in the divorce. I had reclaimed not just my assets, but my very sense of self. The only lingering connection to my former life was Jeffrey Simmons, who had shifted from divorce attorney to trusted advisor as I established my new financial and legal foundations. It was Jeffrey who called me on a Wednesday afternoon with news that would test my hard-won detachment. "Rachel, I just received something you need to see," he said, his typically measured voice carrying an unusual edge. "How soon can you come to my office?" "I have client calls until 4, I replied, immediately alert to his tone. "I can be there by 4:30. What's this about?" "Better discussed in person. It concerns Mark, Summit Financial, and potentially you." My stomach tightened. "Am I in some kind of legal jeopardy?" "No, nothing like that," Jeffrey assured me quickly. "But this information may require decisions on your part. Decisions best made with complete context." I rearranged my afternoon schedule and arrived at Jeffrey's office by 3:45, my mind cycling through possibilities during the drive. Had the SEC investigation expanded? Was Mark trying to claim some additional asset we'd overlooked? Had his family found some new angle to pressure me? Jeffrey's assistant showed me directly into his office, where he sat behind his imposing desk, a thick manila envelope centered precisely on its polished surface. "This arrived by courier this morning," he said without preamble. "Addressed to me, but clearly intended for you." "From whom?" "Vanessa Collins." I blinked in surprise. "Mark's fiancée?" The woman who tried to call me months ago? Jeffrey nodded. The courier service confirms it was delivered from a Boston address. Inside is a USB drive containing numerous documents related to Summit Financial, along with a personal letter addressed to you. Have you reviewed the contents? Only enough to verify there's no obvious malware on the drive and to assess the general nature of the documents. They appear to be internal Summit records, emails, account statements, material that would be highly relevant to the SEC investigation. I frowned, trying to make sense of this. But why send them to me? I have nothing to do with Summit or the investigation. That's addressed in her letter. Jeffrey slid a single sheet of expensive stationery across the desk. I'd suggest reading it before we discuss the electronic documents. The handwriting was elegant and precise, the kind produced by expensive private education. Rachel. You have every reason to discard this communication unread. I wouldn't blame you if you did, but I'm hoping the woman who outmaneuvered Mark so thoroughly might recognize a kindred spirit when she sees one. The enclosed documents provide evidence of financial misconduct at Summit that goes far beyond what the SEC is currently investigating. They implicate not just the leadership team but several major clients, including Wilson Holdings, Robert Wilson's primary investment vehicle. Mark isn't the whistleblower he's presenting himself to be. He was fully involved in these activities until he recognized the risk of discovery, at which point he carefully selected which information to provide authorities, enough to secure immunity for himself while protecting his family's interests. You might wonder why I'm giving you this information. The simplest answer is self-preservation. Mark has begun displaying concerning behaviors similar to what you likely experienced toward the end of your marriage. The controlling tendencies, the financial manipulations, the gaslighting when questioned. History is repeating itself, with me cast in your former role. The engagement you may have heard about is real, but driven by the Wilson family's desire to prevent me from testifying against Mark should the full extent of the fraud be discovered. They believe marriage would allow me to invoke spousal privilege. What they don't know is that I've been building my own insurance policy. I'm leaving Boston tonight and won't return. By the time Mark realizes I'm gone, I'll be established, under a new identity and a location he'll never discover. The documents I'm providing are my parting gift. Use them or destroy them as you see fit. My only request is that you wait 72 hours before taking any action. That's all the head start I need. We're not friends, Rachel, and I don't expect forgiveness for my role in hurting you. But perhaps we can be allies of a sort, women who refuse to be sacrificed on the altar of Wilson family ambitions. With respect, Vanessa Collins. I read the letter twice, then carefully set it back on Jeffrey's desk. Well, I said finally, that was unexpected. Jeffrey nodded. Based on my preliminary review, the documents appear authentic. If so, they contain evidence of significant financial crimes, wire, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, potentially securities violations. And she sent this to me, not directly to the authorities. I shook my head, still processing. Why? Perhaps she doesn't trust official channels. Mark apparently had enough influence to secure immunity despite his involvement. Or perhaps she's exactly what she claims to be, a woman escaping a controlling relationship who recognized you might understand her position. I considered this, remembering Vanessa as I'd last seen her, confident, beautiful, the woman Mark had chosen over me. Had she simply been another tool in his arsenal? A replacement to be used and discarded when she no longer served his purpose? What are my legal obligations here? I asked, focusing on practicalities rather than speculation. You have no duty to report financial crimes you learn about after the fact, especially when you weren't involved, Jeffrey explained. However, if authorities ever discovered you had this information and deliberately concealed it, there could be questions about Your motivations, particularly given your connection to Mark. So my options are to turn these over to the SEC or pretend I never received them. Essentially, yes, though I'd recommend that if you choose to share them with authorities, you do so through legal counsel, me or another attorney experienced in financial regulations. I thought about Vanessa's request for a 72-hour head start. Whatever her motivations, she had taken an enormous risk sending this material. The least I could do was honor that simple condition. I need time to think, I said finally. Can I take a copy of the letter? Leave the USB with you for safekeeping? Of course. Jeffrey placed the letter in a fresh envelope. Take whatever time you need. This isn't a decision to rush. As I drove home, my mind kept returning to Vanessa's words. Women who refused. To be sacrificed on the altar of Wilson family ambitions. Was that how she saw us? Not as adversaries, not as victim and perpetrator, but as women who had independently faced the same toxic dynamics and chosen resistance rather than compliance? The parallel wasn't perfect. Unlike Vanessa, I hadn't knowingly entered a relationship with a married man. I hadn't participated in deception or betrayal. But we had both discovered Mark's true nature, had both recognized the danger of remaining within his sphere of influence, had both taken decisive action to protect ourselves. At home, I poured a glass of wine and settled on my balcony, watching twilight descend over downtown Oak Ridge. The city lights blinked on one by one, creating constellations of human activity against the deepening blue. Somewhere in those patterns of light were people making decisions that would alter their life trajectories, choosing to leave relationships, to challenge authority, to risk security for principle or passion. Vanessa was already gone, disappeared, into a new identity, leaving behind the comfortable future the Wilson family had promised in exchange for her silence and compliance. It was a bold move, perhaps born of desperation, perhaps of calculation, but undeniably courageous in its execution. What was my responsibility in this unfolding drama? I had no legal obligation to act, no personal investment in Summit financials, fate, no remaining emotional attachment to Mark that might fuel a desire for revenge. I could simply destroy the evidence, continue my carefully reconstructed life, and leave justice to whatever natural course it might take. But something in me rebelled against that passivity. Not because I wanted to hurt Mark or his family, but because I recognized the pattern Vanessa had identified, the Wilsons' generational practice of using people as instruments, discarding them when convenient, and leveraging privilege to escape consequences. It was a pattern that would continue unchallenged unless someone chose to break it. I thought of Helen Wilson's visit to my apartment, her thinly veiled attempt to ensure my silence about family financial arrangements. Had she known even then that her son's immunity deal was built on selective disclosure? Had she feared I possessed exactly the kind of evidence Vanessa had now provided? By the time I finished my wine, I had made my decision. I would honor Vanessa's request for a 72-hour head start. Then I would turn the documents over to authorities through Jeffrey, providing a clear account of how they came into my possession, but otherwise removing myself from the process. I wouldn't seek publicity or personal vindication. I would simply ensure that the truth had a chance to emerge. It wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to be complicit in continued deception through my silence. I called Jeffrey the next morning to inform him of my decision, then deliberately immersed myself in work for the next 3 days, focusing on client projects that required my full attention. When the 72-hour window expired, I contacted Jeffrey again. "I'm ready to proceed," I told him. "But I'd like to structure this in a way that minimizes my involvement moving forward." "I've already prepared a strategy," he replied. "We'll work through the Boston field office of the SEC rather than the local office, using my professional connections to establish credibility while emphasizing your role as merely the recipient of information, not its originator." "Perfect. And my name?" We'll appear in official documentation as the reporting party, but I'll request confidentiality protections. Given the sensitivity of the material and potential for witness intimidation, they're likely to respect that request. The handoff occurred with anticlimactic efficiency: a conference call with 2 SEC investigators, a formal statement about receiving the USB drive, a digital transfer of the files, and then silence. No dramatic confrontations, no immediate arrests, no public revelations. Just the slow grinding of bureaucratic machinery beginning its deliberate process. "What happens now?" I asked Jeffrey after the call concluded. "They investigate, which could take months. If the evidence proves substantive, they'll bring formal charges against the involved parties. If not, the matter simply fades away. And if the Wilson family discovers I was the one who turned over the documents?" "They probably will eventually, if charges are filed," Jeffrey acknowledged. "But by then, the information will be thoroughly integrated into the official investigation with multiple corroborating sources. Your role will be a footnote at most." I nodded, surprisingly at peace with the possibility. "I can live with that." Life continued its forward momentum as spring turned to summer. My consulting business expanded, requiring me to bring on 2 associates to handle the growing client list. I finally purchased a permanent residence, a modern loft in a converted industrial building downtown, its open spaces and abundant natural light, a deliberate contrast to the traditional craftsman aesthetic of my marital home. The lake cabin evolved from weekend retreat to creative sanctuary, where I began writing a business book distilling my marketing expertise for female entrepreneurs. Relationships came and went, some lasting a few dates, others a few months, none, progressing to serious commitment as I continued to clarify my own needs and boundaries. Throughout these developments, I maintained only distant awareness of the ongoing SEC investigation. Jeffrey provided occasional updates, subpoenas issued, additional witnesses interviewed, expert analyses commissioned, but the process remained largely opaque, its ultimate outcome uncertain. Then, 9 months after Vanessa's documents had been submitted, the case exploded into public view with a series of coordinated arrests and indictments that dominated national financial news. 7 Summit executives faced federal charges for wire fraud, securities violations, and conspiracy. 4 major clients, including Wilson Holdings, were named as co-conspirators in elaborate money laundering schemes. Robert Wilson, Mark's father, was among those arrested. The patriarch's carefully cultivated reputation for business integrity shattered in a single day of damning headlines and perp walks. Mark himself wasn't charged, his immunity agreement apparently holding despite the expanded investigation. But the public documents made clear his role as both participant in and witness to the criminal activities, destroying any pretense that he had been an innocent whistleblower. His reputation in financial circles was effectively ended, regardless of legal consequences. I received the news via text from Jeffrey. Indictments unsealed. 7 arrests including R.W., M.W. not charged, but extensively mentioned in documents. Expect media attention. The prediction proved accurate. Within hours, reporters began calling. First local journalists who remembered my connection to the Wilson family, then national outlets seeking the ex-wife's perspective on the financial scandal. I declined all requests for comment, instructing my assistant to respond with a simple statement. Ms. Mitchell has no involvement with Summit Financial or the Wilson family, and no comment on the current legal proceedings. Only Olivia received a more candid response when she called, her voice breathless with excitement. "Did you see the news? Robert Wilson in handcuffs, and Mark named throughout the indictment as cooperating witness number 3. It's the scandal of the decade in Oak Ridge." "I saw," I confirmed, keeping my tone neutral. "It's certainly significant." "Significant? It's nuclear." "It's certainly significant." "Significant? It's nuclear. The Wilsons are finished socially. Helen had to step down from all her foundation boards this morning. That family treated you like dirt, Rachel. Aren't you even a little satisfied to see them facing consequences? I considered the question carefully. I don't take pleasure in anyone's downfall, Olivia, but I do believe in accountability. If they committed the crimes they're accused of, then justice should run its course. You're a better person than I am, Olivia sighed. I'd be popping champagne. Later that evening, alone in my loft, I reflected on my genuine emotional response to the day's events. There was no vindictive satisfaction, no sense of personal victory in the Wilsons' public humiliation. What I felt instead was a complex mixture of validation and relief. Validation that my intuition about the family's character had been accurate. Relief that the truth had finally emerged into public view. Somewhere in Boston, Mark would be navigating the collapse of his family's reputation while clinging to the immunity that protected him from prosecution. Somewhere else, under a new identity, Vanessa would be learning about the arrests, perhaps feeling her own version of vindication and relief. And here I sat in Oak Ridge, connected to both of them by circumstance, yet emotionally distant from the drama engulfing them. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thank you for waiting the 72 hours, and for what came after. Be well, V. I stared at the message, wondering how Vanessa had obtained my new number, how she knew about my role in the investigation. Then I deleted it without replying. Our brief alliance, if it could be called that, had served its purpose. We each had our own paths forward now. The media frenzy lasted several weeks, with new details emerging daily about the extent of Summit's fraudulent activities and the Wilson family's involvement. I maintained my silence throughout, refusing all interview requests and declining even Olivia's attempts to discuss the latest revelations. I don't understand why you're so disinterested, she complained during our coffee meetup. This is the perfect opportunity to set the record straight about what you endured in that marriage. The record doesn't need straightening, I replied simply. I know what happened. The people who matter to me know. Public vindication isn't something I need. What I didn't articulate, even to Olivia, was my growing awareness that continued focus on the Wilson saga, even negative focus, would keep me tethered to a chapter I had decisively closed. My identity was no longer defined by my relationship to Mark or his family. I was Rachel Mitchell, consultant, writer, independent woman building a life on her own terms. Engaging with the scandal, even to clarify my role or perspective, would only reinforce the ex-wife narrative I had worked so hard to transcend. This stance was tested most severely when Graham Fletcher, Mark's former divorce attorney, reached out through Jeffrey with an unusual request. Mark Wilson would like to meet with you, Jeffrey reported, his tone making clear his own skepticism about the proposal. Apparently, he's back in Oak Ridge temporarily, dealing with family matters related to his father's legal situation. Absolutely not, I responded immediately. What possible reason could there be for such a meeting? According to Fletcher, Mark wants to apologize personally for his actions during your marriage and divorce. He claims to have undergone significant personal reflection since leaving Oak Ridge. I laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving. His father is facing federal charges, his family's reputation is in tatters, and suddenly he's developed self-awareness? The timing seems rather convenient. That was my assessment as well, Jeffrey agreed. I'll convey your refusal. Thank you. I paused, then added, just out of curiosity, has there been any mention of Vanessa Collins in connection with the case? Any indication she's returned to Boston? None that I've heard. Why do you ask? Just wondering if she managed to truly escape, or if she was drawn back into the investigation. The SEC documents refer to multiple confidential informants, Jeffrey noted. She could be among them, though that information wouldn't be public. I hope she found whatever fresh start she was seeking, I said, surprising myself with the genuineness of the sentiment. Despite the circumstances of our connection, I felt a certain kinship with Vanessa. Not friendship, but recognition of a shared journey from manipulation to self-determination. Jeffrey's voice softened. You know, Rachel, you've undergone quite a transformation yourself over the past year and a half. When you first came to my office, you were understandably focused on financial survival and legal protection. Now you're thriving independently and expressing concern for the woman who had an affair with your husband. That's remarkable growth. His observation caught me off guard, but he was right. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal, who had emptied joint accounts and transferred property deeds in desperate self-defense, seemed like a different person now, not separate from my current self, but an earlier iteration who had needed to pass through crisis to discover her full capacity. I had good advisors, I acknowledged, and motivation to change. After declining Mark's meeting request, I expected some form of persistence, perhaps a direct call, an appearance at my office, even a handwritten letter employing the charm he had once wielded so effectively. Instead, there was nothing. According to Olivia's sources, he remained in Oak Ridge for just 3 days, handling urgent family business before returning to Boston. His restraint was so uncharacteristic that I found myself wondering what had prompted it. Had he genuinely respected my boundaries? Had legal advisors cautioned him against any action that might complicate his immunity agreement? Or had he simply made the strategic calculation that I was no longer useful or threatening to his interests? The answer came unexpectedly during a routine business trip to Chicago, where I was presenting at a marketing conference. After my session concluded, I was gathering my materials when a woman approached, professionally dressed, mid-50s, with sharp eyes that evaluated me frankly. Rachel Mitchell, I'm Patricia Donovan. We have a mutual acquaintance in Vanessa Collins. I froze, immediately alert. You know Vanessa? The woman smiled slightly. I'm her aunt, her mother's sister. She asked me to deliver a message if I ever had the opportunity. Given your speaking engagement here and my residence in Chicago, that opportunity has arrived. What's the message? I asked cautiously. She wants you to know she's safe and well-established in her new life. And she wants you to know that Mark Wilson attempted to locate her through private investigators for months after she left. Investigators who reported directly to Helen Wilson, not to Mark himself. I absorbed this information, its implications immediately clear. So, my refusal to meet with Mark was a wise decision, Patricia confirmed. The request wasn't about apology or closure. They suspect Vanessa provided evidence to authorities through an intermediary. They can't prove it was you, but you're the logical candidate. I see. I maintained a neutral expression despite the chill that ran through me. The Wilsons were still dangerous, still manipulative, still seeking control even as their empire crumbled around them. Thank you for telling me. There's one more thing, Patricia added. Vanessa asked me to give you this. She handed me a small envelope. She said you'd understand its significance. I waited until I was alone in my hotel room to open the envelope. Inside was a single key attached to a cedarwood keychain, along with a note card bearing just 3 words: for fresh starts. The key was unfamiliar, but the cedar keychain held an unmistakable scent that transported me immediately to the lake cabin, the peaceful sanctuary that had provided refuge during my darkest days. The connection was too specific to be coincidence. I called Jeffrey immediately. Has anyone been inquiring about my ownership of the lake property recently? Not that I'm aware of, he replied, sounding concerned. Why do you ask? Just being cautious. Could you check with the county records office? See if there have been any unusual requests or searches related to that property? Jeffrey promised to investigate, calling back the following day with disturbing news. Someone requested copies of the deed transfer documents last month, the ones showing the property transfer from joint ownership to your sole name. The request came from a law firm in Boston. I explained about Patricia Donovan's visit and the key, sharing my suspicion that the Wilsons might be planning some form of legal challenge to my ownership of the lake cabin. Their options would be extremely limited, Jeffrey assured me. The transfer was properly executed and recorded. Mark signed the documents willingly. Any claim of coercion or misrepresentation would be nearly impossible to prove after all this time. But they might try anyway, I suggested. Create enough legal complications to force me to sell or settle. It would be consistent with their pattern, Jeffrey acknowledged. Do you want me to take any preemptive measures? I considered the question carefully. The lake cabin had become my creative sanctuary, the place where I felt most authentically myself. The thought of losing it to another Wilson family manipulation filled me with both anger and determination. But fighting would mean re-engaging with Mark and his family, exactly what I had worked so diligently to avoid. Let's wait and see, I decided finally. Monitor the situation, but don't engage unless they make an actual move. I won't be driven by fear of what they might do. This measured response represented the most significant difference between the woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal and the woman I had become. Then, I had acted from fear and self-preservation, employing secrecy and preemptive strikes because I had no other options. Now I could choose my response from a position of strength, financial, legal, and psychological. If the Wilsons came for the cabin, I would defend my ownership vigorously. But I wouldn't allow the mere possibility of their interference to disrupt the life I had built or the peace I had found. I had moved my assets into my name to protect myself from Mark's betrayal. I had rebuilt my career to ensure my financial independence. I had created a new home that reflected my personal aesthetic, rather than someone else's expectations. These achievements couldn't be undone by whatever desperate maneuvers the failing Wilson dynasty might attempt. I had already won the most important battle, the one for my autonomy and self-definition. Everything else was just details to be managed. I returned to Oak Ridge with renewed clarity about my priorities and boundaries. The key from Vanessa, whatever its intended warning or message, now hung alongside my own keys, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience, of dangers navigated and strength discovered in the process. Whether the Wilsons would make good on the implied threat remained to be seen. But I was prepared either way, confident in my ability to protect what mattered without sacrificing the forward momentum of my life. The woman who had once discovered her husband moving his girlfriend into their home had transformed into someone neither of them would recognize, someone who didn't need to empty bank accounts or transfer deeds to feel secure, someone whose worth was self-defined rather than relationship-determined. That transformation, more than any property or financial settlement, was the true victory, one that could never be taken away. 2 years after that fateful day when Mark brought Vanessa into our home, I found myself standing on the dock at my lake cabin, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. The evening was unseasonably warm for October, a gentle reminder that even as seasons change, moments of unexpected beauty remain possible. I had come to appreciate these small gifts of perspective, these reminders that life continues to unfold, in surprising ways regardless of our plans or expectations. The Wilson family's legal troubles had reached their inevitable conclusion 3 months earlier. Robert Wilson had accepted a plea deal, avoiding a lengthy prison sentence in exchange for his testimony against former associates and a substantial financial penalty that effectively dismantled Wilson Holdings. The family's name had been removed. From hospital wings and university buildings throughout Oak Ridge, their generational legacy of philanthropy overshadowed by the revelations of financial fraud that had funded it. Helen Wilson had escaped criminal charges, but not public censure. Once the unquestioned social leader of Oak Ridge's elite circles, she now lived quietly in a modest condominium, her calendar empty of the charity galas and board meetings that had previously defined her existence. According to Olivia, who couldn't resist sharing occasional updates despite my professed disinterest, Helen had aged a decade in a year, her carefully maintained appearance giving way to the realities of stress and social isolation. Mark himself had fared better, at least superficially. His immunity agreement had protected him from prosecution, and his family connections, though tarnished, had secured him continued employment in Boston. But his engagement to Vanessa had dissolved with her disappearance, and rumors suggested he had descended into a pattern of short-term relationships and increasing alcohol consumption, seeking in these temporary escapes what he had failed to build through genuine connection. I felt no satisfaction in these outcomes, no vindictive pleasure in the Wilson family's downfall. Their choices had created natural consequences, as all choices eventually do. My focus remained on my own evolving life, which had expanded in directions I could never have anticipated during those fraught days of discovering betrayal and fighting for financial survival. My consulting business had grown beyond independent practice into a boutique agency specializing in marketing strategy for women-owned businesses. We maintained offices in both Oak Ridge and Chicago, the expansion fueled by a reputation for integrity and results rather than social connections or family influence. My business book for female entrepreneurs had been published to modest but meaningful success, leading to speaking engagements and workshops that connected me with women navigating their own journeys of professional reinvention. More surprising was the personal evolution that had accompanied these professional achievements. The woman who had once feared being left destitute by her husband's betrayal now approached relationships with confident discernment, neither avoiding intimacy nor rushing toward commitment. I had dated thoughtfully, learning from each connection what I truly valued and needed in partnership, rather than what social expectations or family approval might dictate. 6 months earlier, those lessons had led me to Michael Harrington, an environmental attorney who had consulted on the legal protection of the lake where my cabin stood. Our professional interaction had evolved naturally into friendship, then into a relationship characterized by mutual respect and authentic connection. Unlike my marriage to Mark, built partially on social advantage and external validation, my relationship with Michael grew from shared values and genuine compatibility. He understood my independence because he valued his own. He respected my achievements because he was secure in his. And most importantly, he recognized that love existed in the continuous choice to support another's growth, rather than in the possession of their loyalty or resources. "Beautiful evening," Michael observed, joining me on the dock with 2 glasses of wine. Though the forecast suggests we might be the last people enjoying this view until spring. Snow predicted by the weekend. I accepted the glass, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. I've been thinking about weatherizing the cabin, making it truly 4-season rather than just a warm-weather retreat. "Major renovation," he noted. "You're that attached to this place?" The question was asked without judgment, a genuine inquiry rather than a leading suggestion. This was what I valued most about Michael, his commitment to understanding my authentic preferences rather than projecting his own expectations. "I am," I admitted. "This cabin saw me through the darkest period of my life. It was here that I began to recognize my own strength, to envision a future built on my terms rather than someone else's. It feels important to maintain that connection, regardless of the season." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Then weatherization makes perfect sense. I know a contractor who specializes in eco-friendly renovations for older cabins, minimal disruption to the surrounding environment while maximizing energy efficiency." "I'd appreciate that recommendation," I said, sipping my wine. "But it's not just about practicality. I want to make this place truly mine in a way it never was during my marriage. Different furniture, different colors, different energy entirely. Reclaiming space," Michael suggested, "creating something new from what was once shared." "Exactly, though I've been hesitant to begin, given the Wilson family's apparent interest in the property." After learning about the Boston law firm's request for the deed transfer documents, I had waited for some legal challenge to materialize, a claim of coercion or misrepresentation perhaps, or an assertion that the cabin should have been included in the marital assets subject to division. But months had passed without any formal action, leaving me in an uncomfortable limbo, reluctant to invest in significant improvements to a property that might still be contested. "Has there been any recent movement on that front?" Michael asked. "Nothing concrete. Jeffrey says that could mean they've abandoned the idea, or they could be waiting for the criminal matters to be fully resolved before opening a new legal front." Michael considered this, his expression reflecting the careful analysis that characterized his approach to both legal matters and relationship dynamics. "Either way, it's keeping you in a holding pattern, unable to fully claim the space because of lingering uncertainty." "Precisely." I turned to face him directly. "And I'm increasingly uncomfortable with allowing even that much continued influence over my decisions." "So what are you thinking?" I smiled, appreciating his direct question rather than immediate advice-giving. "I'm thinking it's time to force the issue. Reach out through Jeffrey, acknowledge awareness of their interest in the property, and request clarity about their intentions. Either they make a formal claim we can address, or they confirm they have no plans to contest ownership." "A proactive approach," Michael nodded approvingly. "Reclaiming control of the narrative rather than waiting for them to set the terms of engagement." "Exactly. I spent too long in my marriage allowing Mark to establish the parameters of our relationship. I won't make that mistake again, even in conflict." The decision, once articulated, brought immediate relief, another small step in the ongoing process of claiming agency rather than accepting circumstance. I would contact Jeffrey in the morning, set the wheels in motion, and move forward regardless of the response. The cabin would become fully mine, either through their confirmed disinterest or through successfully defending against whatever challenge they might mount. We finished our wine as darkness settled over the lake, the water reflecting a canopy of emerging stars. The silence between us was comfortable, devoid of the tension that had characterized so many quiet moments with Mark. Moments when unspoken expectations and unacknowledged resentments had filled the space between us. "Should we head inside?" Michael suggested eventually. "It's getting chilly." "In a minute," I replied, my attention caught by movement at the edge of the property, headlights turning onto the private access road that led exclusively to my cabin. "Are you expecting anyone?" Michael frowned. "No. You?" "No one." I felt a familiar tension rise in my chest, the vigilance that had become second nature during the worst days of my divorce. "It's nearly 9. No delivery service would come this late, especially to a remote cabin." We watched as the vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, approached slowly, its headlights illuminating the rustic exterior of the cabin before cutting off entirely. In the sudden darkness, I could make out only the silhouette of the driver's door opening, a tall figure emerging against the backdrop of distant trees. "Stay here," Michael said quietly, his tone concerned but controlled. "I'll see who it is." "No." I placed a hand on his arm. "This is my property and likely related to my past. We'll both go." Together we walked from the dock toward the cabin, where the unknown visitor now stood beside the silent vehicle. As we approached, exterior security lights activated, revealing a face I recognized immediately despite the passage of time. Mark. Wilson looked both familiar and foreign, recognizably the man I had married but altered by circumstance and choice. His features had hardened, his once carefully maintained appearance now showing signs of strain. He wore expensive clothing that hung slightly loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. But it was his eyes that revealed the most significant change, their characteristic confidence replaced by something that looked disconcertingly like genuine uncertainty. "Rachel," he said, his voice carrying across the space between us. "I apologize for arriving unannounced." I maintained a careful distance, acutely aware of Michael beside me. "This is private property, Mark. What are you doing here? I needed to speak with you directly. Your attorney declined to arrange a meeting. Because I declined your request, I pointed out. That should have been the end of it. Mark's gaze shifted to Michael, then back to me. I understand your reluctance. But what I have to say can't be communicated through intermediaries. Whatever you need to say can be said right here, I replied evenly. This is Michael Harrington, by the way. My partner. Mark nodded a terse acknowledgement before focusing entirely on me. I'm here about the cabin. So this is about the property after all, I said, unsurprised but disappointed nonetheless. Your family's law firm has been investigating the deed. Transfer. What's your claim? Coercion? Misrepresentation? Or are you simply hoping to leverage my desire for peace into some financial settlement? Mark looked genuinely startled by my directness. You know about the title search? I maintain vigilant oversight of my assets these days, I replied, a habit I developed through necessity. He had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. That's fair, but you've misunderstood the purpose. I'm not here to contest your ownership. I'm here to confirm it, legally and permanently. Now it was my turn to feel surprised. What do you mean? The title search was conducted at my request. Not my family's, Mark explained. I wanted to verify that the transfer was properly recorded and that no lingering claims existed. Once confirmed, I had my attorney prepare this. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a document folder, extending it toward me. When I didn't, immediately take it, he continued. It's a quitclaim deed. It explicitly relinquishes any potential interest I might have in this property, now or in the future. It also includes a legally binding acknowledgement that the original transfer was conducted with my full knowledge and consent, without coercion or misrepresentation. I accepted the folder cautiously, opening it to scan the document inside. The legal language matched his description, a complete and permanent relinquishment of any claim to the property, with additional provisions preventing future challenges. Why would you do this? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Our divorce agreement already established my ownership. Mark's expression shifted, revealing an emotion I had rarely witnessed during our marriage. Genuine remorse. Because I owe you this. Certainty, he said quietly. And because it's the right thing to do. Michael, who had remained supportively silent beside me, spoke for the first time. This seems like a conversation that requires context I don't have. Would you prefer privacy? To discuss this, Rachel? His question exemplified the fundamental difference between the men. Where Mark would have made assumptions about my preferences, Michael asked directly, prioritizing my agency over his own curiosity or comfort. No, I said firmly. Anything Mark needs to say can be said with you present. Mark nodded acceptance of this boundary. The collapse of my family's reputation and finances has been clarifying. For the first time, I'm experiencing what you felt when you discovered my betrayal. The disorientation of having everything you believed about your life revealed as precarious, if not false. There's a significant difference, I pointed out. Your situation resulted from your own choices and actions. Mine was imposed without my knowledge or consent. You're right, he acknowledged, surprising me again. And that's part of why I'm here. Not for forgiveness. I don't have the right to ask for that, but to acknowledge the harm I caused and to make what amends I can. By signing over property that's already legally mine? By removing any lingering uncertainty about its status, Mark clarified. My mother mentioned visiting you, attempting some form of persuasion regarding family matters. I recently learned that she also discussed contesting the cabin transfer, suggesting it might create enough legal complications to force you to settle. The confirmation of Helen's machinations wasn't surprising, but Mark's apparent distance from them was unexpected. You weren't part of that strategy? No, he said firmly. though I've given you ample reason to believe otherwise. The truth is, I've spent the past year in recovery, both from substance dependency and from the distorted perspectives that defined my life in Oak Ridge. Part of that process involves making direct amends where possible. I studied him carefully, looking for the manipulative charm that had once obscured his true intentions. Instead, I found only weary authenticity, a man stripped of pretense, by circumstance and perhaps finally, capable of genuine reflection. What are you hoping to gain from this, Mark? A cleaner conscience? Permission to move forward without the weight of past wrongs? I'm not expecting anything from you, he replied. Your life appears successful and fulfilling without any input from me. This isn't about what I hope to gain, but about what I can give back. In this case, absolute certainty about property that clearly matters to you. Michael spoke again, his legal mind evaluating the document I still held. The quitclaim seems comprehensive, but I'd suggest having your attorney review it before accepting its terms. Absolutely, Mark agreed immediately. I've already sent a copy to Jeffrey Simmons for his assessment. He should receive it tomorrow morning. The thoughtfulness of this approach, respecting both my legal interests and my established professional relationships, further underscored the apparent change. In Mark's perspective, the man who had once planned to leave me destitute while moving his mistress into our home now stood before me, ensuring my ownership of property already legally mine. I appreciate the gesture, I said finally, though I admit I'm struggling to reconcile it with your previous actions. I understand that, Mark acknowledged, and I'm not asking you to reconcile them. People can change fundamentally while still being accountable for their past choices. I am responsible for how I treated you during our marriage and divorce, regardless of who I might be becoming now. This distinction between changed behavior and erased responsibility suggested a depth of reflection I wouldn't have believed possible from the Mark I had known. Recovery programs speak of making amends without expectation of forgiveness. Perhaps he had truly embraced that principle. Is there anything else? I asked, ready to conclude this unexpected encounter. Just one thing, Mark said. Vanessa. The name hung in the air between us, laden with complex implications. What about her? Is she safe? The question seemed genuinely concerned rather than investigative. After she disappeared, I realized how my behavior must have frightened her. The same controlling patterns that characterized the end of our marriage. I've tried to locate her, not to reestablish contact, but to apologize. I maintained a neutral expression, unwilling to confirm or deny any knowledge of Vanessa's situation. If she wanted contact with you, she would initiate it. Mark nodded, accepting this boundary. You're right. I hope wherever she is, she's found the fresh start she deserves. He glanced at his watch, then back at me. I've taken enough of your evening. The quitclaim deed is yours regardless of whether you accept my explanation or motivations. I truly wish you well, Rachel. As he turned to leave, a question rose unbidden in my mind, one I had never expected to ask, but suddenly needed answered. Mark, when did it change? When did you stop seeing me as a partner and start seeing me as an obstacle? He paused, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. It was gradual rather than sudden. Each time I compromised my own integrity, in business in our marriage, it became easier to view others as means to ends rather than as complete human beings. You didn't become an obstacle overnight. I became someone capable of seeing you that way through accumulated moral concessions. The insight was striking in its self-awareness. That's a surprisingly thoughtful analysis. 18 months of therapy and recovery provide ample opportunity for reflection, he replied with a hint of his old dry humor. Goodbye, Rachel, and thank you for hearing me out. We watched in silence as he returned to his vehicle, the SUV's headlights illuminating the private road before disappearing around the bend toward the main highway. Only when the sound of the engine had faded completely did I exhale fully, the tension I hadn't realized I was holding finally releasing from my shoulders. "Are you okay?" Michael asked quietly. "Surprisingly, yes," I replied, still processing the encounter. That was unexpected. "He seems genuinely changed," Michael observed, neither endorsing nor challenging the transformation Mark had presented. "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "though I'm more interested in our response to him than in his evolution." "Our response?" I nodded, turning to face Michael directly. "Throughout that entire interaction, you supported my autonomy rather than attempting to protect or speak for me. You offered perspective without asserting control. That contrast with my previous relationship is illuminating." Michael smiled, understanding the significance of the observation. Equal partnership requires equal agency, especially in challenging moments. We returned to the cabin together, the quitclaim deed placed on the kitchen counter for morning consideration. Whether Mark's apparent transformation was genuine or merely another calculated performance ultimately mattered less than my own continued growth, my capacity to engage with the past without being defined by it, to acknowledge old wounds without allowing them to determine future choices. Later that night, lying beside Michael in the peaceful darkness of the cabin bedroom, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the shock of discovering betrayal to the strategic maneuvering of assets, from the painful divorce proceedings to the gradual reconstruction of a life entirely my own, each step had contributed to the woman I had become. Mark had intended our separation to leave me diminished, dependent, defined by loss. Instead, it had revealed capacities I might never have discovered in the comfortable confines of our marriage. The woman who had once transferred everything to her name out of desperate self-preservation now owned not just property and financial assets, but the narrative of her own life. The cabin renovation would begin the following spring, a comprehensive transformation of space that had witnessed my most vulnerable moments into a sanctuary designed entirely for the person I had become. The weatherization would allow year-round access, ensuring I never again limited my presence based on external conditions or others' expectations. As for Mark's apparent redemption, I neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected it. People can indeed change, sometimes profoundly, in response to consequence and reflection. But my life no longer orbited around his choices, good or bad, selfish or generous. I wished him well in his recovery journey not because it erased the past, but because bitterness served no purpose in the future I was building. The quitclaim deed would be reviewed by Jeffrey, filed appropriately, and added to my organizational system, another piece of documentation securing the independence I had fought so hard to establish. But the true security came not from legal papers or financial arrangements, but from the inner certainty that had replaced my former vulnerability. No one could move into my home without my consent, whether a girlfriend, a partner, or the ghosts of past betrayals. The craftsman house, where Mark had planned my disposal, now belonged to another family creating their own story within its walls. The cabin where I had rebuilt my sense of self now stood on the verge of physical transformation to match its emotional significance. And I, the woman who had once discovered her husband's ultimate betrayal, had discovered something far more valuable in response: the capacity to rebuild not just circumstances but self-conception, to transform crisis into catalyst, to stand firmly in an identity defined by resilience rather than reaction. As sleep approached, I found myself filled with an unexpected sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, which remained an indefensible breach of trust, but for the growth it had ultimately inspired. Mark had transferred property to protect himself. I had transferred it to protect myself. But somewhere in that parallel action, divergent purposes had created entirely different outcomes. He had lost a partner, a reputation, a family legacy. I had found myself. Morning brought clarity and decision. After reviewing the quitclaim deed with Jeffrey via video call and confirming its legal soundness, I filed the document in my secure organizational system and turned my attention to the cabin renovation plans. The weatherization would begin in the spring, followed by interior updates that would transform the space completely while preserving its structural integrity and connection to the natural surroundings. Michael returned to his environmental law practice in Oak Ridge while I remained at the cabin for several more days, using the solitude to work on my second book. This one focused on financial empowerment for women navigating significant life transitions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The experience that had once threatened my financial security had become the foundation for helping others protect theirs. On my final morning at the cabin before returning to Oak Ridge, I stood on the dock one last time, watching mist rise from the lake's surface as sunrise painted the sky in delicate pinks and golds. The scene reminded me of that long-ago evening when I had first recognized the full extent of Mark's betrayal, when I had made the decision to fight rather than surrender to his carefully constructed exit strategy. The woman standing on the dock now bore little resemblance to the one who had once tearfully contemplated an uncertain future. I had built something substantive from the ruins of betrayal. A thriving business, a meaningful relationship, a clear sense of purpose and identity, independent of external validation or protection. When Mark moved his girlfriend into our home, he believed he held all the power, financial, social, strategic. He couldn't have imagined that his actions would catalyze my journey from dependent spouse to self-determined woman, from reactive victim to proactive creator. I had transferred everything to my name initially as a desperate act of self-protection. Now, standing on my dock, breathing deeply of the crisp autumn air, I recognized the deeper transformation that had occurred alongside those legal maneuvers. I had transferred my very identity from externally defined to internally generated, from contingent to autonomous, from reactive to intentional. That was the true asset I had secured, one that could never be diminished through betrayal or enhanced through approval. It belonged solely to me, the product of difficult growth and conscious choice, rather than defensive reaction or inherited advantage. With one final glance across the lake, I turned toward the cabin, toward the life I had built, the future I continued to shape, and the self I had discovered through the very crisis meant to diminish me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.